Okay, fantastic. I can see that there are still some people trickling in here, but we're at 12:02, so we're going to get started because we have a lot to talk about during this session. I'm very pleased to welcome everyone here, and thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Bessie Schwartz. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Cloud to Street, and I'm very pleased to co-facilitate this community session along with my dear colleagues and friends, Amit Wadhwa and Andrew Kowalski from the UN World Food Program and the Red Cross, respectively. Our organizations, these three organizations, are really at the forefront of some of the scientific, technical innovations for disaster analytics and innovation. And we've talked for many years, actually, the three of us, about how we can actually do things in our space differently. And when I say differently, I think what really unites the three of us is that all of this advanced science, the machine learning revolution, the satellite revolution, advances in technology, is really that the purpose of this is to make it actually work for people who are on the front lines of responding and preparing to climate disasters, which is why we are so proud to bring together this panel, this conversation, which is really about telling the stories of the data and data's importance through the voices and the stories of people who are really on the front lines and those who are supporting them. So we're very excited about the panel that we have here today. Because we know that just having data and then throwing that data over the wall doesn't mean that much. And so we really want to ask, so what if you just have data? So over the next 50 minutes or so, I'm going to first set the stage for this conversation of the next couple of minutes. I'll then introduce everyone and we'll dive into a panel discussion with the speakers that we have. And then we'll wrap up with a couple of ways to continue the conversation, keep it going after this conversation. Throughout the conversation, there'll be an opportunity to ask questions, and we hope to have some time with those to answer those questions towards the end. So please submit those in the chat. But the first thing I want to say is just to not acknowledge the time that we're in right now. I really wish that we were all able to be here together in Singapore. But those of us in the disaster space, what we know well is that something like a virus, something like a flood, something like a fire is a shock. A crisis comes when it interacts with your ability to absorb that shock, the underlying vulnerability or strength of that system to absorb it. So I think we can beg the question of whether or not this virus actually had to turn into the level of a crisis that it did. And climate change, by many accounts, will be worse than what we've seen today. And how we are able to absorb the extreme hurricanes, the droughts and famines, the fires, the other catastrophes, in many ways is a factor of how much we respond now and the systems for response that we're able to put in place, the resilience of those systems. And while there have been massive leaps forward in how we understand these catastrophes and the science behind climate change and disasters, what really we want to think about here is the strength of those at the front lines and how we support them in order to absorb the shocks that we know are coming. So, and at Cloud to Street, I know we think of this part of it, sort of the users of these tools, not as the last mile, but as the first 1,000 miles, and really the last 1,000 miles then of any kind of solution. And in reality, it's actually much more iterative than that. And I know that I'm sort of joined in that perspective by these facilitators. So to do just a bit more of an introduction to those here, Andrew is the faculty lecturer at the Department of Earth and Environmental Science and a senior researcher at the IRI Columbia University, as well as a science advisor at the Red Crescent Climate Center. Andrew and his team researched the constraints and opportunities for integrating Earth observations within the humanitarian decision-making and policy-related risk management. And Amit, who's the global manager at the PRISM project within the WFP, leads their ability to monitor climate risk systems. And this system is used by governments, and it combines Earth observation data with hazards, with information on social economic vulnerability, is designed to do risk reduction and risk response. PRISM began in Southeast Asia, including a major focus in Cambodia, and we're really excited to have Indira here to talk about those experiences. And we at CloudStreet have worked quite a bit with PRISM, mostly in Sri Lanka, where they integrated the CloudStreet data. And we're very excited to do more together going forward. CloudStreet is a disaster analytics platform. We are a public benefit corporation designed to fill critical information gaps in government work, in insurers, and the financial markets. We use satellite data, AI, and crowdsourcing in order to detect floods faster and analyze risk remotely and more accurately for common floods. We've been operating in 25 countries, and we're really proud to have very recently been awarded a global agreement with the UN WFP. So more work to come with Amit and PRISM and other partners. And now on to the panelists. I'll have them introduce themselves in their own words a little bit more when we ask the first question, but we're very pleased to have such a panel with us today. And with that, let me dive right into the first question with them. The first question that we wanted to start with, and I have the pleasure of asking, is really about the information needs that that you all have during a disaster. And we'd really like if you could walk us through before, during, and after. Let's stick first with flooding, since that's a main focus of many of us here. So walk us through what your information needs are and then how you access it. And I just want to encourage the speakers to tell some stories from their work on the ground or supporting others on the ground. So with that, I'll turn it over to our panelists.
Thanks, Bessie. Should I start? I'm Indira. I'm at the World Food Programme in Cambodia, and I lead the vulnerability analysis teams, nutrition and social protection. And as Bessie mentioned, we use the PRISM platform, and that integrates different data sources, including remote sensing data that we get through our partnership with ADPC, as well as socioeconomic vulnerability data, and also data we get from the National Social Registry through the Ministry of Planning. And we use this platform in many different ways. So one of the ways in which we use it is really to try and identify before an event, how we can really, what are the areas most at risk, how we can best identify where we need to be focusing our preparedness actions, and really try to inform. We work very closely with national disaster management officials to develop contingency plans and really make sure that they are prepared in the case of an event. And in the aftermath of an event, we use this system to identify quickly what are the areas that are likely to be the most affected. And then we can focus our attentions there, conduct a rapid assessment. Our PRISM system in Cambodia is a little bit different in that we also have data integrated directly from our subnational disaster management officials. So we're also getting data from the field as soon as it comes in. So we have this secondary data as well as this other data coming in from the field. So we can quickly identify what the needs are and act in terms of informing the government and also the humanitarian community. Thanks.
So maybe I can go next. So hello everyone, my name is Fabio Chan. I'm a scientist working as a consultant for the World Bank in the frame of disaster risk finance and disaster risk management. My background is in Earth observation and environmental economics, and my research has been focusing mainly into streams. One more on purely technological remote sensing work like flood mapping or rain cover classification, but also on risk assessment, focusing on floods, vulnerability, and economic impacts. So since a few years, I'm working for the World Bank, where I've been involved more consistently in activities in the field, being much closer to decision maker compared than I used to be at the beginning of my career as a scientist. Something that I find very interesting, open, that broaden a bit my point of view. So to reply to your question, Bessie, I think my work at the bank, it's more focused on the before and after the flood rather than during the flood, because we don't really work on the, let's say, preparedness actions. And for me, before the flood means risk assessment, and after the flood means more impact assessment or post-disaster need assessment, as we call it at the bank. And the most important information can be different depending on if we are talking before or after the event. But I can say that, yeah, there are many different information that we would like to have. So it's very difficult to choose what is the most important information that we would like to have. And most of the time we would like to have all the information on the highest quality possible. But thinking about my recent experience and the recent work of the last months, I can say that exposure data is something that to me could be the most important. And yeah, I can consider exposure data differently if I'm talking about before or after the event. So if I talk about before the flood, despite the tremendous advances that we have seen in the last months or years in exposure data, still there's a lot that can be improved. And I think this is very important because you can have the best modeling of flooding, for example, or the best flood map coming from satellites. But this could lead to a very, let's say, imprecise risk result if your exposure data are not precise. But also, if we are talking about after the flood, in our work, we need to know precisely the exposed elements to the flood, so people or assets that have been affected by the event. And this is key for us to understand how the situation has been evolving, how to face the post-emergency phase. So to plan for a better, let's say, build back better strategy or increasing the resilience of the area that we are analyzing. So I would say this is the most important information from my point of view. Thank you.
Okay, hello everyone. I'm very glad to represent the WFP Republic of Congo country office. I work as partnerships and information management and reporting officer there, based in Brazzaville. WFP Congo and Cloud2Street have been working together since 2017 on the monitoring of the systemic floods affecting the northern part of the country, which faces climate change and extreme weather events. And during the different flood responses, I work as a focal point for WFP within the National Humanitarian Group, and I do the liaison between Cloud2Street and the national stakeholders, UN agencies, NGOs, and the government. And so to answer your first question, Bessie, WFP and the Humanitarian Group, we are active all along the disaster cycle. So before the flood, we need to prepare and alert. So the needed information are historical data and maps about floods in the area and the risk trend. We need a detailed profile of the population present in the flood risk area. Are they refugees, autochthons, their vulnerabilities and their livelihoods, and how it would be impacted. During the flood, we need to respond, and to respond quickly. In terms of data, it means having a weekly update of the situation and the impact of on the field, on the targeted and strategic areas and thematics. And it will help us design the response plan and launch the assistance as quickly as possible. And after the flood, once the water's level is back to normal, we discover the long-term damages, and that's when we need to help the population to recover. And in terms of data, it concerns mostly the livelihoods and crops, and the state of the soil. Knowing the most affected crop areas is really necessary, and they will be cross-referenced with information on the cropping calendar. So yeah, all along the disaster cycle, this is what we need in terms of data solution.
I mean, thanks so much to all of you for sharing. I feel like we could jump in on a lot of the elements of what you've talked about here, and I know we have limited time. Amit, I think you're gonna jump in here next, but if I had one follow-up that we maybe could weave into some of the other questions before I turn it over to Amit, is just diving into examples from the ground, from points that all of you have made, or circumstances when you, Indira, you a live combination of the remote sensing data and the field data in order to validate what you've done, or Ophélie, the work that you've done to actually make a different decision on the ground because you then had information you didn't have before. I'll turn over to Amit, who's keeping an eye on the time as well, but I'm excited to get into some more examples of some of the important points that you've all brought up.
Thanks, Bessie. Thanks to all the panelists as well. So my question sort of builds off of what Bessie was just speaking about, some examples. So we know there's a lot of buzzwords around the use of technology and data in our field, and especially in the context of lower income countries. But this sort of tends to this idea of where this situation where you're just throwing data over the wall and there's a deluge of information, despite a recent focus in recent years on capacity development. So my question is, if you can give an example of a data-driven solution that's worked and where in some cases it has not worked, and how can capacity truly be strengthened to match that deluge of data? So I'll hand it back over to the panelists.
Thanks, Amit. So perhaps I can give the example of the recent flooding in Cambodia. So in October, there was quite wide-scale flooding. And so this gave us an opportunity to try and use the different system and information that we have coming together. And, you know, I think that we, as Amit says, there's lots of different data that we have, but it's very difficult, I think, for practitioners to make sense of it and really understand what does that mean for response. And, you know, we have different levels of capacity in the country and lots of different information. In our case, we had, from our partnership with ADPC, we had a certain flood extent map coming in. We had a different one coming in from HQ, and that led to some slight confusion. We're lucky that in-house we have some people that can work on it, and we managed to sort of explain what the differences were, what the different assumptions were. But I think that this was something that we had to really work on, making sure that there was clear messaging on, okay, this is the data, they're both right in their own way, and this is what they're showing, and this is what it really means. And then I think we also then took the opportunity of, you know, we have this remote sensing data and vulnerability data, but we also have real time, or as close to real time as we can get, field data collection. And so then we can say, okay, the remote sensing data gives us an estimate of where we think will be affected, but this is what we're hearing from the ground. And then we rapidly sent out teams. Again, it was quite complicated. There were 35 different agencies we were coordinating, as well as with the government, to send them out to these areas. But using that remote sensing data and our kind of key informants, we could identify what are the areas we really need to go to better understand those needs and really get that additional data we needed to inform a rapid response. But the thing that became very clear, I think, in this process is the different levels of understanding. You know, I think I am by no means a remote sensing expert, but I have an analytical background, but a lot of practitioners do not. And I think there was a lot of people that weren't very familiar with maps. They weren't very familiar with the different data streams, and we found it really important to have different types of different types of maps, different types of products that we were developing so that it could really inform those responses. And I think in the longer term, we've really thought that, and we're planning to do this in collaboration with ADPC, is to build capacity on GIS skills and remote sensing. But we're thinking of this in 3 different ways. One is just basic interpretation and linking that to disaster response. And I think there's a big push of, okay, let's use software, let's give people training on that. And they don't necessarily need that. They need to be able to read the map or be able to see the information and understand what that means for them. But then there are other people that we, in the longer term, want to build that GIS capacity, remote sensing capacity. And that's where we're trying to do this in partnership, both with ADPC and local academic institutions. So in the long term, we build the capacity nationally for that. Thanks.
Yeah, I can continue on what Indira just shared, because I think I have a story that is connecting somehow to what Indira just told us. I think, yeah, it's a very good point, Amit, and thanks for raising it. So the story I wanted to share is for a flood risk assessment project we are conducting. Of course, at the beginning of the project, we had to produce and gather a lot of geospatial data, and therefore, among other things, what we have done was to contact and ask to local stakeholders and decision makers what kind of data they have available, what they were able to collect for us, and so on. And it happened that one of these counterparts expressed the need to be trained in GIS and geospatial analysis. So they were really aware of the usefulness of this kind of data, but also of their limit in understanding and producing data. So it happened that we were able to offer them a GIS and drone mapping training. So basically, they had already established a GIS task force. So they gathered some technical people that had some basic skill on the topic, and we were able to train them for a few days on GIS and drone mapping. And from the training, so we tried to teach them how to, basic knowledge about GIS and mapping, but also how to use this information in the context of flood risk management. So after the training, they were able to progress independently and to use some drone data that we helped them to acquire to digitize. They were able to digitize building footprints in the entire area of interest, and also building footprints, roads, and so they're planning to use this information to build addresses code for the area of interest because they don't have any addresses. They're planning to use it for a better management of waste collection, which is very, very much connected to flood management in the area because garbage is impeding water to flow and so on. So this to share that this experience to highlight how a fairly small action, but very much tailored to the needs of the decision maker, of the stakeholders, was able to bring a real impact on the field and allow them to actually build capacity and long-lasting capacity, I would say. And yeah, I think this is very important, and this we have it in the title of this session, this concept, so that our action can be data-driven, but must be user-centric. Thank you.
And I can also give you an example of when data solution worked at the local level. And it was in 2018, an influx of DRC refugees crossed the Congo River. And at that time, the WFP country director asked to CloudToStreet whether the area where the DRC refugees were located in camps was floodable or not. And within 3 days, CloudToStreet provided historical risk maps that predicted that Makotipoko, where the refugees were, was at very high risk of flooding. And so we went to see the Ministry of Social Affairs and Humanitarian Action, and convinced by the maps and the high risk, they decided to relocate 7,000 of refugees. And actually 10 months later, the place was totally flooded. So that's a good example of a real impact of the data and the higher and the risk maps.
Great, thanks so much, everyone. I'm now going to hand it over to Andrew for a few more questions.
Thanks, Amit, and thanks, Bessie, and thank you to all of the panelists. So one of the unique elements of this session is that not only from the perspective of Bessie and Amit and I, we do have overlapping interests and activities. However, we do come from different backgrounds, and we approach this community kind of through different lenses, as well as the panelists. We have 3 panelists here that, well, 2 are from the World Food Program, but have different roles and responsibilities within that very large organization. And then we have Fabio, who represents more of the science side, but also has a range of experiences in the applied space, and as well as algorithm development. So we have different panelists here with different backgrounds, different expertise, and different interests. And this session, as well as an opportunity to answer questions that we ask, we thought it would be a nice opportunity for them to potentially, or hopefully, let's say, engage with each other to seek guidance or seek ideas related to some of the challenges that they are facing. So as you all represent different sectors involved in disaster risk management, what is one barrier that you have that you've been thinking about? What is a challenge in your work that you could ask advice from one of the other panelists? So I'm hoping that somebody would like to take the lead on this. But yeah, feel free to ask your fellow panelists for some advice on the challenge that you're facing.
Sure. Perhaps I can start with a question to Fabio. I think we slightly touched upon this already in the question before, but I think you have a quite interesting background, being an Earth observation specialist, but also working with local stakeholders in the government. And as we see, there can be sometimes a bit of a divide between the scientists and the practitioners. How can we better bridge this gap, and how, as a practitioner, can we better communicate to scientists so that we can get products that are actionable and that are easier to use?
Thanks, Indira. Indeed, there's a gap that I experienced myself, let's say, having these 2 kind of different personalities, now coming from the purely scientific world and working now more closer to decision makers. I think I connect to the title of the session again, so data-driven and user-centric. I think we should see our approach should be not one versus the other, but really data-driven, user-centric altogether. No? So as a scientist, for example, now that I'm more involved in the decision-making process, allow me to understand better how to produce the data, how to disseminate the data, which kind of assumption, limitation, and whatever the data I'm producing. I have to I know better how to communicate this underlying information. On the other hand, for a decision maker, I'm realizing that having them more involved in the production of information, take, for example, risk information, risk data, allow them to better understand the process of creating that information, and therefore they understand them better, they understand better their limitation, their usefulness, and it's helping in trusting the data and using them, I think. Yeah, I think that's what I think. I think both sides should be involved on the other point of view.
Thanks, Fabio.
So maybe since I have my mic open, I can proceed with my question. So
yes, please do.
Yeah, so either Ophelia or Indira, whoever wants to pick up on this. So as I was saying, as a scientist, I've been a lot involved in the production of data, of algorithms, of maps, and so on. So you really understand very good that process of let's say of the risk information chain. Now I'm more involved in putting together data to create risk information. What I'm missing that from my experience is how to understand how this information can be used to encourage end users to take the information, make sure that they're using in the right way, in the way that is meant to be. Yeah, so this could be something that I could really learn a lot from your experience, I think.
Maybe I can answer from the end of the chain point of view, because here we are non-technical user. At the end, we have products. We don't use data tool, but we have products from cloud to street. And how we use it at the end, it's really for internal and external advocacy with donors and with local stakeholders. It's really to raise awareness of the need for a response, for a quick response, and the need for funding. Whether in a country that is not a priority here for emergency humanitarian response, that's really useful for us to have some accurate data to rely on. And at the national level, those final products, those final data products, they are really used as a reference for the situation and its evolution, because there is actually no technical capacity to bring up some accurate figures from the field on a regular basis during a crisis here. So yeah, at the end of the chain, the data you produced are really useful. That's it.
Can I come in there as well?
Yes, please do.
Yeah, I mean, I have I have an example in Cambodia of how we're trying to use risk analytics. So what we're trying to do here is we're trying to connect risk analytics directly to develop thresholds and triggers for action. And that's sort of an ongoing project we have here, both with the humanitarian community and with the social protection system. And so what we're trying to do is develop a sense of, okay, if we reach this threshold, this will trigger a response maybe through the social protection system, or trigger some sort of action in the humanitarian community. So these analytics are super useful in the preparation of that system and identifying who might be vulnerable, how we can develop these systems, and also in an event, how we can respond quickly.
Thanks, Indira. Thanks for the reactions. I think something that's beginning to emerge, not only from the answers to this question, but from the previous question, is this concept of different use cases of Earth observation data. I mean, the role of the usefulness, as defined as usefulness for an advocacy piece versus usefulness to let's say justify setting a threshold within the activity of developing triggers for funding. Those are very different types of activities. So I think, yeah, as Fabio said, the more that we encourage scientists to engage at an early stage with decision makers and policymakers is great. But how do we incentivize that? And I think this is something that I think we'll get to as we move on in the session, but thinking about the incentive structures for scientists to engage. There has been a push. Myself as a physical scientist, it is definitely something that I know the community is moving towards, but how do we ensure that there is resources available for this sort of in-between brokering type of activity? But thank you all for that, for those reflections. We appreciate that. And yeah, we will carry on with the session, handing it over back to Amit.
Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, my next question is also somewhat related. So, I'm really interested to hear from each of the panelists about perceptions and satellite-based estimates of risk and hazard, and how those can be used for operational decisions. I think there's a clear divide between the technical producers of the satellite-derived products and the end users. So my question is, how can we build trust in these estimates, especially for the non-technical users of the data? And what would like an ideal scenario look like for building that trust before a disaster? So I hand it back over to the panel for your responses. Thanks.
Okay, I'll take a stab at that first. Yeah, I mean, I think as I mentioned, I think people have, there's a lack of understanding of really what the satellite data is showing, and I think that's something that we are really trying to work on in Cambodia. There's not so much of an understanding of where it's an estimate and what might result in differing figures, and I think being very clear on what the assumptions are and what it should be used for and how we can always validate and calibrate that data, I think is really important in building trust. I think that there's often people want to kind of overstate what it's showing, and that can result in issues. And so I think being very clear on what it is and what it is not is quite important. And having that kind of consultative process, even though we have a system that displays lots of different information, we always produce analytical products, and that's spelling out sort of what it shows and really sort of trying to make it actionable. And we, as I mentioned earlier, we also try and produce sometimes different maps. We got a bit of feedback from people who are working in more of the management level of disaster responses, that they found some of the satellite maps a little bit difficult to read. They weren't really sure what it meant in terms of severity. So we produced another simpler map where we just categorized areas that was easier for them. So I think there's always, it's really great having all this data and information, but again, there's still some need for human interpretation and translation. And working on that before is really good, but also during it as well.
Yeah, I can connect very well with what Indira said, and I totally agree that sometimes as scientists we get lost in our data space. Let's say, no, we really like what we are doing, and we tend to forget what our data actually is not representing. So I think it's very important for scientists, for data producer, to keep always in mind the physical phenomenon that the data is describing. And then I think I repeat myself saying what I said before, involving the end user. I think it's really important to build trust in what you are delivering, because in two ways actually, because a local stakeholder, decision maker, can actually improve your data, the data you're producing, because it can transfer knowledge that you cannot know, not knowing that the data you are, the area that you are describing with your data. So from one side, that could improve the precision, the robustness of the data you're producing. On the other hand, making the end user part of the process can build, as I said before, can make the end user understand better what you're producing. So how this information is produced, where it is coming from, which are the limitations, and can give a sense of ownership of the data itself. So I think you can build trust when the end user it's in the process and see how the things have been developed. So yeah, I think that could be 2 points that can improve the perception of operational decisions.
As end user in Congo, there is also a big lack of understanding on what we do with data. and trust has been built over time. The ministry is involved, the Ministry of Humanitarian Action and Social Affairs is involved in and aware of Cloud2Street's work with the WFP since 2017 now. And the main interest with these satellite-based estimates is to have access to accurate information at the right time and to the right people. And yeah, to build or to strengthen the trust between us, Cloud2Street, and the local stakeholders, the solution that we found is to really involve, make proactive the national stakeholders, really offer them the opportunity to interact and to be actors of the data process and the data use. And it works, and we see over time, and especially this year, a clear engagement which enable to be better prepared, to respond faster, and to easily communicate, which was not the case several years ago. And from one year, one flood to another, we see a lot of improvement in the response and the coordination. And I think that the data solution is really part of this improvement.
Thanks so much to all of you for sharing on that last question. I just wanted to push a little bit, I think, on this really important topic about communication and understanding, and really would love your thoughts on how much understanding is required across each area. I think there will always be scientists will never, and outside technical data providers will never fully understand what's going on the ground, and folks on the ground who are not fully accustomed will never understand the full details. I think this is just the reality of communication and working interdisciplinary and across fields. And I think having translators in between, like the example that Indira just provided about how she can think through both the situation on the ground and think across the variety of information they're getting, that is really essential in between. We as a Cloud2Street, in our experience, players on kind of one side of it, we often really struggle with how much detail to provide in the data. And a lot of times the scientists on our team at Cloud2Street are big, we need like all the confidence levels in there, we need to go all the methods, and we can't give any number unless we have a full background on it. And I completely understand that concern, that perspective, and that we really need to have people fully understand where this number came from before using it at all. But I've also had government officials say, you want me to sit here and read your whole method with everything that I've got to do? Like, I just need to act, you guys. And then a lot of time, the more detail that we provide will actually lead sometimes to a lack of confidence. Like, oh, I can't understand this. I'm just going to go with the simpler thing that I already know. So I'm just curious your thoughts on the balance of this and where the responsibility lies within each part of this sector, users, scientists, and everyone in between, to help the other side, to translate for the other side and help them understand, and then try to speak in their terms.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really interesting question. And when we were looking at the PRISM interface, one of the things that we thought about was how much detail do we play around with? Do we have all of these, statistics that you can do with it? And at first I think we got quite excited about having something very extensive, and then realized it was completely confusing and didn't make any sense. I think, the approach that we've taken is we're lucky that we have some in-house expertise to be able to do this translation. And we spend a lot of time working with governments to sort of explain, I mean, by no means are we experts at all, but explain at least some of the key assumptions and what it means. And this I would say is a bigger issue on the drought side than it is on the flood side, where there's a plethora of different indicators, and we've had a lot of feedback of, okay, what does this mean? What are the actions? Whereas at least we can, on the flood side, we can verify it a little bit more easily. But yeah, I think I come back to this sort of at least being able to explain what we're introducing what it is and what it is not, and how we can understand that. Maybe we don't need to know the confidence interval or anything like that, but maybe we need to understand, okay, if it shows this area is, you know, part of the flood extent, it's an exposed population. It doesn't necessarily mean that this is an area that is experienced some severe event or anything like that. There's still, it's really just being clear, I think, on those assumptions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a quick thing to jump in on there is, I think that we found is a really good idea of building in almost somewhat of a vagueness in some ways to what you're presenting. Like, just one really small example that we got from Jean-Martin, who's the former country director in the Republic of the Congo, was never to use a decimal point unless we were very confident, but always use rough numbers just to imply like it's approximate and, you know, it might not be this exact number, or even maybe a range of within what we were confident, and that people were really comfortable with that.
Yeah, maybe I can add a bit on that. Yeah, I think, yeah, simplicity is for sure something very important. So sharing complicated stuff, it's always very, very difficult. I have to admit that I'm still learning a lot in how to communicate data and information. So probably I don't have much to add that is very, very intelligent to say. I don't know how to put it. What I feel that I want to share as a scientist, I mean, my effort is to really understand the process of decision making, to understand how I can improve the information we are producing and the way we share it. So that for sure it's something that let's say from this side on science we have to do in order to make our effort more effective. Also, let me be a bit provocative maybe. I think also the same effort should be done also on the other side, right? So I totally understand we cannot be expert in everything. So it's very, yeah, we cannot expect to have a decision maker or politician to understand an algorithm of machine learning, for example. I'm not expecting that. But you know, build more knowledge around how these information are created can really help this process a lot. Which is, yeah, this, I think it's a very, very difficult issue to solve. So the way we perceive information, depending on the background or the situation we are coming from, can be really totally different. So it's a very complicated, at least for me, it's a very complicated subject.
Maybe if I can add, as you said, Bessie, national decision makers don't want to spend too much time to understand technical data. So that's why we need to be able to easily communicate those data to the government and make them proactive in the process. And that's where we need to really perceive the needs. And I think that this is something we do very well, WFP and Cloud2Street in Congo, and through weekly updates in really easy format to read, messages going straight to the point, by WhatsApp in French, and the information is present, it is understandable, and I mean, national stakeholders cannot ignore those really easily understandable data. So I think this is a good solution to really involve the government and the national stakeholders who are not really technical.
Great, thank you everyone. I wanted to acknowledge a question from the audience from Patricia, which I think is pretty crucial to some of the things that we've already discussed, which is really how do you deal with this confusion of different information coming into government decision makers, especially during a disaster. And she's asked about what are the different ways you'd approach this? Is it giving more information on the model results? Is it about building capacity in local authorities? Or is it about communication with governments? And I feel like those latter two, the capacity development and the communication with governments, are what has surfaced from the panelists in terms of what's really, really important here. I wanted to also field this other question from the audience from Lisa, and then I wanted to, just being conscious of time, I hand it back over to Andrew. So the question from Lisa to the panelists is, how much time do you allow for non-experts to understand the data that you're providing? How do you develop that understanding and those relationships over time? And to what extent is staff turnover an issue to developing that understanding and relationships in a humanitarian setting? And that's definitely something I can relate to in terms of developing capacity and staff turnover. So very interested to hear your thoughts from the panel.
Okay, sure. So maybe to the first question, in terms of the different estimates, what we do is we try to combine the data and tell one story. So in the case that the example I've given before, we actually combined the different flood extents to create one map that told the story. And in terms of the time we give to non-experts to explain or to sort of strengthen the capacity, I think as WFP in Cambodia, we definitely see our role as providing capacity strengthening and technical assistance to the government in this area, and that's sort of our main function. So we spend a lot of time in this space, and we've spent a lot of time fostering those relationships. I think, you know, definitely we've been very, very fortunate that we haven't had to face this staff turnover issue. We have some people who are very, very key in the office that I would be very scared if we lost them about what we would do. But I think the way that we've been trying to tackle that is also to build the capacity of national institutions. And that's the way in which we see, at least if we have hubs within the country, that will be something that will provide that TA in the longer term, in case we lose those critical people, which hopefully we will. Thanks.
Yeah, maybe I can quickly pick up on that. I think, yeah, I totally agree with Indira. Finding the right people in the right place, it's sometimes it's really key, and this can allow you to be much more effective than otherwise. I can share other experiences with World Bank, and in this respect, like as much as we can, we try to build capacity and to provide training, let people understand the data we are producing. One concrete example is for a project we have in the Gambia. For example, together with the European Space Agency, we are providing training to them on so that ESA has this program that maybe some of you knows. It's called Earth Observation for Sustainable Development. So it's providing services for decision makers in the frame of sustainable development. And for us, they produced some products for the Gambia. And we decided that there was no mean to produce something that it's just for us. I mean, that when local stakeholders, decision makers are not aware how to use this information, and they don't know how this is produced. And next week, we are going to have a 2 days workshop, virtual workshop in the Gambia, where ESA is presenting the products they produced, and they are showing how they produce these maps and products. So I think, yeah, this is something that we can do to improve the situation on this side.
Great, thank you both. I'm conscious of time here. We have just a few minutes left. I believe, Andrew, were you going to do a wrap for us?
Yeah, just a few minutes. I realize we're already a minute over, but I just want to again thank our panelists to sharing your perspectives and your stories. Thank you to my co-facilitators for putting this session together. But I wanted to just take a minute to pull together some ideas and some of the questions that have been discussed and also present in the chat. And I think one element that's emerging here, and I'm going to try to present this wrap up from each a science, policy, and practice perspective. So it's really the three of those that enables that gap between developing data and use of the data to be better understood. There are different forces, sometimes competing forces, of which leads to prioritizing maybe science over policy, over mandates, over urgency to make a decision. But going back to the process of developing data, this is not a single action. It is a process. Developing data takes time. Using data, likewise, making decisions with data is also not a single action. It's a process or a set of processes. These are very complex systems. And the same goes for the space in between. With the recognition of the need to better understand that gap between developing data and using it, within this session, I was very happy to see examples and narratives that highlight the challenges, and at least to some degree, highlight the privileged space that we are all in. And with privilege comes responsibility, and with responsibility comes accountability. And I think in some ways, when we're referring to Earth observation, satellite data, I mean, that could be seen as one of the peak representations of privilege. You know, we are monitoring various things, elements, and people don't even know that these are being monitored all around them. So I think one of the outcomes of this, at least for me, is thinking about the responsibility or rethinking our responsibility. Should the data developer be accountable for the use of the data? What happens when the official data at the government level differs from the best or most appropriate data? What do we do? Who needs to be at the table to decide which data is used to inform a decision? And this may be less of a concern if the action is prioritization of action, but how about deprioritization? Selecting where to help is in some ways easier to justify than selecting where to deprioritize. And all data has some degree of uncertainty, leading to at least some level of risk, whereby the data may be perceived as misinformation, depending on people's perceptions of intolerance of uncertainty. So this is another discussion that's coming up around this in-between space between data development and data use. But also, to what degree should the real world of the decision maker be integrated into the critical elements of the data dissemination design, as well as the algorithm development design? I mean, these are non-trivial actions, and this requires allocation of resources to encourage not only engagement across from users down to scientists and back, but also substantive engagement and following a process, a user-centric design process that allows for this to be replicated and to be better understood. How can we normalize and incentivize these discussions? Well, there are questions that are emerging, and this is a space to allow for that to further emerge. So in closing, we all seem to agree that users and data scientists need to work together. This is not a new concept. However, in 2020, we are still calling for that. In addition to calling for more engagement, perhaps we should present complementary questions. What are the thresholds for building trust? How will we know when we reach those thresholds? Is there a spectrum of scientist and decision maker engagement? And thinking beyond this group, this is the group that showed up because we care. This group here, we showed up because we care. But what about the other people to incentivize engaging in this space? There's an opportunity we are all facing, which has been exaggerated by COVID, which is to understand and promote what makes for appropriate and ethical data-driven decision-making. This is increasingly important as data availability and accessibility increases. And in this moment, do we, as an interdisciplinary group, do we have the responsibility to design a call to action and a call for resources from each data scientists, potential users, and for this translator broker space to facilitate, convene, and integrate the data? What is our responsibility to do that? So I thank everybody for joining, and I encourage, along with the co-facilitators and the panelists, encourage all of us to stay in contact on this topic and push it forward in a way that we could come together and try to close this gap between data development and use. So I'll hand it back over to Amit and Bessie for any final comments, but again, thanks everybody.
Thanks, Andrew. Appreciate that. I just wanted to call attention to, there's a link into the chat for a forum where we can keep in touch. Bessie, I don't know if you want to mention anything about this idea of a community of practice, but yeah, thanks from my side for everyone's participation.
Thank you so much to everybody for a fantastic discussion. And obviously this is just scratching the surface, as a 50-minute conversation only could, and we're even over here. As Amit said, the Google link here is to stay in touch, but also for a potential community of practice. So we're looking to have more conversations like this between data scientists and frontline folks on the ground working in climate disasters. And actually, this is going to be a lot as a space for people in different contexts who are working on disaster management, actually to share best practices directly about how they've used data. So if that seems like that is you fall into those, please just click on the link, let us know if you're interested, and we'll provide more information about that in the next couple of weeks. So thank you so much again, especially to all of our panelists.
Thank you very much, Bessie, Andrew, Amit, for organizing.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks for
Thanks a lot.
participating. Appreciate it. Bye-bye.